Hello, everyone, and welcome to this members-only live stream. We're so glad you could join us for this very interesting topic, John Philip Sousa. We have just passed the anniversary of his birthday, and we thought it would be really interesting to dive in just a little bit to learn more about this man. Now, I will confess I did not know a lot about his personal details, but like most of you out there, when you hear the songs that he composed and created, played, you recognize the songs. These are some of the most memorable, recognizable songs in the entire American repertoire of music. And who was the man who created these songs? Well, they're very martial. They're really marches, and we'll learn more about marches in general towards the end of the program. But who is John Philip Sousa? Well, he was born November 6th, 1854. In other words, before the American Civil War. We're talking about someone who's fairly old and long ago. He began learning music when he was very young, only 8 years old, around 61 or 62, and had a professional music teacher come into the home. His father was actually a trombone player, or became a trombone player for the United States Marine Corps Band. And, of course, his father wanted his son to have an excellent musical education. So his son began learning at age 8. He began learning violin, piano, flute, voice, and a variety of brass instruments. So this is something that it's not just one or two types of instruments that we get. Sousa is steeped in all these different instruments. And as it turns out, he has perfect pitch. In other words, he can create a note without having to hear something to tune to. He knows it immediately. So that, of course, is going to contribute greatly to his ability to compose and perform music. Now, his father gets him an enlistment, a minority enlistment into the United States Marine Corps Band, and he plays in the band until his 21st birthday in 1875. So poor John Philip Sousa, I'm not sure he had much choice in the matter. He goes into the United States Marine Corps Band at age 13 and serves until he's 21 in the Marine Corps Band. He's going to get a lot of experience, a lot of practice, military marches, military drills, and things like that. He's not composing yet, though. So in 1875, he does turn 21. He goes off and performs in a variety of orchestras. He travels around the country playing mostly violin, a string instrument, ironically. But then comes back and rejoins the Marine Corps Band as its director in 1880. And from 1880 to 1892, he is the director, the guy in charge of the United States Marine Corps Band. This is the president's own. And the Marine Corps Band has always sort of been the one who plays all the formal ceremonies for the president, for inaugurations, for state functions, and things like that. And as director of the Marine Corps Band, Sousa is not only playing marches and playing songs, he's composing them as well, and he serves under 5 presidents. He is under Rutherford B. Hayes, James Garfield, Chester Arthur, Grover Cleveland, and Benjamin Harrison. So that's 5 presidents, and plays at the inauguration of 2, Garfield and Harrison. And so many of the songs he composes that we know, but not the one, we'll get to that in a second, he begins to compose as director of the United States Marine Corps Band. And many recordings are made. We're at the very beginning of these recording period on wax disc, and so Columbia records a lot of the songs with him as conductor. Now he serves again in the Marine Corps Band until 1892, and he requests being discharged from the Marine Corps Band because he realizes there's actually a much more lucrative life in the private band world. So he does get decommissioned out of the Marine Corps Band, and soon after that, the very next day, begins to have plans for the Sousa Band. He organizes the Sousa Band, and he leads this band from this point, from 1892 until he retires in 1931. So this is a long time to have this band together. And this is something I had to learn. I just always assumed that he was always in the military, always in the Marine Corps Band. Not so. He goes out of the Marine Corps Band before 1900, even though he has at that time composed the official anthem of the Marine Corps Band, Semper Fidelis. the Sousa Band performs all over the world. I think I saw a figure that they had over 15,000 performances in between 1892 and 1931, but ironically, only marched and played for a very few of them. I think it was 8 that they actually marched. The rest of the time, they're just sitting there in the bandstand. So now I want to talk just a little bit about some of the marches that he composed and when he composes them. Again, this is just a partial list. He composes a great amount of music. His first one that is ever published is The Review in 1873. Notice that's when he's still an apprentice in the Marine Corps Band, when he's young. And then, there's a gap there. And then we get to the Gladiator March in 1886. And then in 1888, while he's conducting the Marine Corps Band, he composes what becomes, as I said, the Marine Corps anthem, Semper Fidelis. And again, you'll recognize this when you hear it. And Washington Post in 1889. That's what he does while he is in charge of the Marine Corps Band. But of course, his composing career continues, and some would say grows, when he goes into the private band business. And in 1893, he composes the Liberty Bell. Many of us will recognize this as something that is played at the end of every Monty Python and the Holy Grail, or Monty Python and the Flying Circus. Apparently, Monty Python really likes Sousa because his marches are in there, and images of Sousa are used in some of the cartoons. In 1896, he composes what is, without question, his most famous march, most famous song, The Stars and Stripes Forever. And this has become one of the standards of American patriotic music. It is played everywhere. It is a very popular thing, and I think we're going to learn a little bit more about that later. He also composes in 1902 the Imperial March, which was done in honor of the King of England, King George. When World War I starts up, we get Columbia's Pride in 1914. I think everyone knows the United States is going to get pulled into this. And then in 1917 and 18, he writes a couple of songs for the U.S. Army and for the U.S. Navy to sort of get them going. And he is commissioned into the U.S. Navy in 1917 when America enters the war. And when America enters the war, of course, they're going to need lots of music and lots of bands and things like that. So Sousa's not a spring chicken at this point, but you could say he's in his prime. And not the Marine Corps, but serves in the Navy. And for the length of the war, serves in the U.S. Navy, being the lead bandsman, and composes some music, does a lot of concerts. And then when the war's over, he comes out. But it's interesting, from this point on, he wears his U.S. Navy uniform for most of the other performances that they do. It's just it's a cool look, right? You can see from the picture it's a cool look, and he's definitely going to want to stick with that. Now, as I said, Stars and Stripes Forever is by far the most popular song, and it is all over the place for the Great War. And it's so popular that it's not translated, but it's sold in different countries. And you can see here the sheet music for it in the United States, and then next to that, for it in France, the Marche Américaine, right? So, and again, you have to remember that this is how people get music at this point. We do have some basic phonographs, but the sale of sheet music is how you determine how popular a song is at this time. Not selling records, because there aren't a lot of those. It's how many copies of the sheet music are sold. And John Philip Sousa's sheet music is sold in huge amounts. Sousa continues to develop things, and like folks who want a particular sound out of their band, he's looking for something that's going to be a little more musical friendly. So he works with a fellow named James Welsh Pepper, and this is right after he gets out of the Marine Corps, and he wants an instrument that's going to project music up into the air rather than forwards or backwards the way a lot of the instruments do at the time, like tubas. So he, and along with Pepper, develops the sousaphone. And you can see a photograph of it here, one of the very early sousaphones. It sort of wraps around and then shoots the sound straight up into the air. And mostly this is what marching bands use now, right? It projects a lot of sound upwards and outwards, and conveniently, the way it wraps around the body, it makes it a lot easier to move and to march in marching bands for something like this, rather than just having to carry a big tuba over here to the side. So the sousaphone is something that is still with us today in almost every marching band, at least high school and college marching bands have those. So Sousa does continue to go on after World War I. His band continues to tour, playing pieces that he has composed, and he does. But he's not just a musician. This is what's interesting. Of course, we think of Sousa as the music man, but he also has a life outside of that. One of the things he loves to do, his biggest hobby, is trap shooting. When they throw the clays up in the air and you take them out with a shotgun. Apparently, he is very good. He helped develop the sport in the United States, helped sort of regulate it and create a national institution for it, and is in the Trap Shooting Hall of Fame. He absolutely loved trap shooting. And there's this really interesting quote. Let's see, when he's talking about how much he loves it, he says, "Let me say that just about the sweetest music to me is when I call pull, the old gun barks, and the referee in perfect key announces dead." So he took it pretty seriously. He also apparently wrote, I didn't know this, he wrote a novel, or at least a novella, a short work. And surprise, it's about music, and it's about this demonic violin that has 5 strings. And, the four strings incite different emotions and things. But if you play that 5th string, it will be the most beautiful note ever, but it kills the person playing it. And so the story is about this person who gets this violin and finds out and avoids that 5th string. But as is so often the downfall, the guy's girlfriend says, "But I really want to hear that 5th note. I bet it will be beautiful." So because he is in love, he plays the last note on the 5th string and falls dead. I'm not sure if that's a romance. I'm not sure if that's a parable, but it's something to definitely keep in mind when you're dealing with haunted musical instruments and overbearing girlfriends. Now, it's interesting, too, to note that we have some recordings of the Sousa Band, but not many of them that we hear are when he was conducting. Sousa apparently did not like at all the idea and the concept of recording music and playing it again. He just thought that was anathema. He thought music should be live. He almost didn't want any part of it. He very much scorned it. I don't think it's because he was a Luddite necessarily. He just thought that it was going to eventually compromise the ability of everyone. And I've got another great quote from him here when he's actually before a congressional committee talking about how these things should be regulated and things like that. This is from 1906. "These talking machines are going to ruin the artistic development of music in this country. When I was a boy, in front of every house in the summer, you would find young people together singing the songs of the day or old songs. Today, you hear these infernal machines going night and day. We will not have a vocal cord left. The vocal cord will be eliminated by a process of evolution, as was the tale of man when he came from the ape." So this man is not very fond of of recorded sound, and nevertheless, this is how many of the original recordings have come down to us. As I understand it, very few of the recordings of the Sousa Band are ones that he was actually actively conducting. He would bring in a guest conductor when there was a recording that was going to be done. Now, and as I said, he goes on. The Sousa Band goes to 1931. He retires, but then he passes away in March of 1932. And interestingly, apparently the day before, he had just been working on, he had been conducting a band for the Stars and Stripes Forever, which seems appropriate. And you can see here an image of his gravesite, recognizing his lifetime, as well as that bench back there, I believe was put up by the Marine Corps in recognition of him being the director of the Marine Corps Band for the years 1880 to 1892. And then here next to me, you can see the official ceremonial conducting baton of John Philip Sousa, which I think is pretty neat. And he is, of course, considered the American March King. We all, as I said, you'll recognize these songs, and I think they're always going to be with us. There are very few more patriotic songs. And one of the interesting things about Sousa and the pieces that he composed, you can, when you start to study the different marches of different countries, you kind of get a sense of what their military is like. They can be very rigorous, they can have certain times, so the certain step, but American marches tend to be sort of loose. It's like as long as you're in step, the American march doesn't really care how you look or if you're very formal or very rigid when you're marching, and that very much reflects the American fighting man and woman, especially in the 20th century. There's not a lot of formal military rigor to them when they march, but man, when they march, you know, they mean business. And so that the marches of Sousa really reflect that. But marches are a fascinating topic in and amongst themselves, especially when you consider what impact they've had on marching bands, on brass instruments, and they're some of the most popular and as I said, jaunty type of music that we can have. So we are pleased to have an interview with a fellow named Dr. George Foreman from UGA. He is a very accomplished musicologist and composer and conductor. And for 13 years, he was in charge of the large director of the Great American Brass Festival. And if you're going to have marches, you have to have brass. So let's listen in as we have a great interview with Dr. George Foreman. So here we are with Dr. George Foreman from UGA, the great musicologist. And Dr. Foreman, tell us just a little bit about yourself and your music experiences.
Well, I grew up in a very small little town in West Texas, and learned to play the trombone because my older brother had taken up the trombone. It only lasted a month or two, and there was one in the closet for me, and intended basically up through my college years to be a high school band director. But along the way, got very interested in music history and ended up doing my graduate degrees in musicology, and sort of combined all the interests and have done research in primarily American band history. And it's a great field, and there aren't many people doing it, really.
If you would, tell us just a little bit about how you yourself were introduced to march music, and and tell us just a little bit about the style of music that marches are and what distinguishes it from other types of music.
Sure. Well, I guess my initial interest came when I was in high school and playing the trombone and the band. And I had two friends in particular. One played the trumpet and one played the euphonium. And we used to just love to get together. One of my friends lived out on a farm, so we could play as loud as we wanted to. And the three of us would get together, and we had a couple of books of marches and just play marches for an hour or two. And oh gosh, his dog would howl because it hurt his ears. And I just really kind of developed a love for it. And then never was really a school band director. I directed quite a few bands in different ways, but just loved it. And it led me to interest in the history of bands and that sort of thing. And you ask about marches. Well, they are a functional kind of music. Marches are composed to do what the genre says, to move troops from one place to another, marching. And as such, then, if you think about it, it's fairly straightforward. The music needs to be have a steady beat so that you can step to it. And probably 2 beats to the measure, because we go left, right, left, right, left, right, and then not go so fast that it's not comfortable to march. And one of the issues I have actually with a lot of modern band directors is that they play marches way too fast, because they lose track of the idea that the music was intended to be marched to. And if you play too fast, you're not going to march to it. And the Army, for the military, actually has set standards. The step for marching in the military, the Army at least, is 30 inches. And it is done, the marches are to be played at 120 beats per minute. And that works out quite comfortable to march to. Mm-hmm. And again, you have the sort of two beat pattern to marches. So you go left, right. And it's that sort of thing is not unique to marches. If you think about waltz, for example, you have boom, ching, ching, boom, ching, ching, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And when you deviate from that, if you're familiar with Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony, his second movement is a waltz, but he did it in 5 beats to the measure, not 3. So we have 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. And that really put a hitch in your get along if you try to waltz. So, yeah, marches are pretty straightforward, tended, particularly in the early days, to be, relatively short pieces. Most marches are 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes, and generally very appealing to audiences. People love marches.
Well, and you're talking about the proper beat for the military to march to at a certain rate. Are there differences historically in different nationalities' marches? Is there like a specific national rate of march that's reflected in their march music?
That's a good question. Well, there are different functions that marches perform, and I don't know if they're related to national taste necessarily, but for example, if you have a march intended to be played at a funeral, for example, which might be called a dirge, it's going to be slower than a regular march to be in keeping with the function of what's happening. And there are faster marches. You've seen people marching really fast. Yeah, so I think there is definitely national character, which of course is also really, if you think about one of the functions of marches, because marches, I think, are intended to call forth patriotism. Mm-hmm. And when we think about the Stars and Stripes Forever of Sousa, that is the ultimate patriotic American march. In fact, the Stars and Stripes Forever has been designated by Congress to be the national march of the United States. That's a law. Yeah.
Well, so, speaking of Sousa and the marches, tell us just a little bit about, we've been talking about him today, and he's obviously very, very beloved in the military community and martial music, but what kind of reception did he get in the general public in his heyday, the 1890s, the 1900s, early 1900s?
Well, he got a very warm reception, and he was an extremely popular entertainer. Sousa's father was a member of the Marine Band in Washington, D.C. So John Philip Sousa grew up in the military band world, but that was not really what he intended to do. He did not play a band instrument. He played the violin, and his goal was to sort of be America's answer to Gilbert and Sullivan and write operettas. And he was playing violin in operetta orchestras when this opening for a leader of the Marine Band came up, and he got the job in 1889, I guess, and became leader of the Marine Band in Washington, D.C. then, and remained as leader until 1892, when he left the Marine Band and started his own professional band, Sousa's Band, which toured, toured until the last year of his life, which was 1932. By the way, we just celebrated Sousa's birthday less than a week ago. Sousa was born on November the 6th, which is easy for me to remember because it's also my birthday.
Oh, well, that sort of sets big shoes for you to fill then, doesn't it?
Well, I knew good and well I couldn't fill those shoes, so I never took up trying to write music at all. Sousa was, as I said, very, very popular. Perhaps, certainly one of the most popular entertainers in the world. And I mean, not just in America, in the world. And a couple of things that people probably don't know really helped that out. And one was a dance. And we all know, whether we know it by title or not, Sousa's Washington Post March. And I always say that to people, and then they kind of have this blank look. And I say, well, let me sing a little bit of it for you. Da, 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 dum, 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 dum. And I'm telling you, 99 out of 100 people will join in singing immediately. Oh, yeah, I know that. Well, they don't know the history really, though. That march is named for a newspaper, the Washington Post newspaper. And he was asked to write something for the Marine Band to play at a ceremony where the newspaper awarded medals to all of one representative from each grade in the Washington Public Schools for an essay contest. So he wrote it, and it was a good march and gained some certain level of popularity. But what really set it off came about 4 years after he wrote it, when a new dance craze took over the country. And the professional dancing teachers regretted this coming in because it was so easy to learn. It sort of put most of them out of business. But that was the two-step dance. And the Washington Post sort of became the official music for the two-step dance. And so two steps were danced to march music, perhaps slowed down just a little bit. And back in the days, you don't see it so much now, but used to in antique shops, you go to the back corner and there'd be a foot or two thick stack of piano sheet music. Mm-hmm. And if you looked through it, after 1894, music that came after that didn't just say so-and-so march, it would say so-and-so march and two-step. And Sousa, the Washington Post, became so connected with the two-step dance that in England and the UK, Washington Post became a generic name for all two-step dances. So they didn't say, okay, we're going to dance a two-step now. They would say, okay, we're going to dance a Washington Post now, even if it wasn't the Washington Post per se. So that really was one of the things that that boosted Sousa's fame. And he even considered the Washington Post to be his most famous march after the Stars and Stripes forever. And Sousa became such an icon. I can show you say how he influenced popular culture in some ways that maybe people don't think of. But, Sousa wrote approximately 130 marches. I think 132 of them were published. And they would always be published for both band and piano, because people would hear the bands play them. They wanted to go home and play it on the piano. And almost every home had a piano in those days. So let me give you a little trip through piano sheet music. Here's a piece that was from like about 1889. And you see it's just a pretty plain typography sort of cover. Now, this is Sousa's Washington Post. Yes, it's perhaps a little bit more ornate than the one we saw before, but still just sort of typography. So at the time Sousa wrote the Washington Post, which was 1889, he had been publishing music with a publisher in Philadelphia named Harry Coleman. And Sousa was not making any money off of his marches because Harry Coleman would buy the music outright and he would own it. And Sousa sold Harry Coleman the Washington Post March for $35 flat. And that's all the money he ever got out of it. And Harry Coleman got rich. If you look on this sheet music cover right here, you can read that he published it for piano solo, piano four hands, piano six hands, mandolin and piano, mandolin and guitar, guitar solo, zither duet, zither trio, banjo solo or duet, and banjo and piano. And you see people all over the country were buying this to play it on whatever they could play. Well, Sousa got smart and he got a new publisher. And that was a publisher named John Church in Cincinnati. And Sousa had a much better arrangement with him because he received royalties and he got pretty well off because of publishing. But the Church company came up with this cover design. And if you look at the elements of it, you have the picture of Sousa, you have the title at a slant across the cover, and then you have the composer's name and maybe what it wrote. That became a standard cover design for Sousa marches during the 1890s, and 6 or 8 of his marches have that same basic design concept. It became so popular as a march composers that other people imitated the cover design so they could look like Sousa. So here's a piece by a well-known band leader and composer, but you see it's got the same elements.
Yeah.
This picture, the cover, the title of the slant, and then the other information there. So, that was a real influence on the cultural history of popular sheet music at that time. And Sousa's name, people, Sousa was very, very generous about playing the local favorites march when he was on tour with his band. So the band did not, Sousa's band was so good, they didn't really need to rehearse these marches. They'd pull into a town, somebody would take the march, they'd put it on the stand, they'd play it. And that happened all the time. He played things. Well, once Sousa played somebody's march almost without fail when they would bring out, piano sheet music or a band arrangement of that music, they would put on it as played by John Philip Sousa and Sousa's band. So, he's trying to sell. So this is perhaps a radical example now, but this is an empty tin can from Sousa brand oysters. I don't know if you can see that clearly or not. I guarantee you, Sousa didn't make a nickel off of that. Somebody just stuck his name on a can of oysters and there it was. So Sousa was, he wrote, we all think the best marches that anybody ever wrote. And he was really a culture and entertainment icon in his day. He also did something really important, and that is the form of the march. That is the way a march is put together, really crystallized with Sousa. And when we think of marches the way they're put together now, the model we think of is the way Sousa did it. So earlier, say mid-19th century, most marches were what we call ABA form. You had an opening part, then you had a part in the middle, which they call the trio, and then you just repeated the opening part again, A, B, A. That, by the way, was the same basic form that we use for many dances. So the minuet, for example, you would have minuet, trio, then you play the minuet again. So A, B, A. Sousa expanded that a little bit. So the typical march, Sousa march, we will have an introduction. It's maybe 4 measures, 8 measures. Then what we call a first strain, or a first melodic section, 16 measures long, that repeats. Then we have a second strain, or a second, 16 measure thing that repeats. Then we have the trio. And so far, that's not altogether different than what we have been having, but we don't have after the trio. The trio usually has an opening part that's repeated. Then it has a transitional section that we fondly refer to as the dog fight. And after the dog fight, then the trio melody is repeated again. And we do not typically have the return to play the A part, the ABA part. And Sousa marches, dogfight, people love it. I'll tell you about the dogfight, the Stars and Stripes Forever. You'll recognize this part. You know, when the low brass, and then they go, that's the dogfight scene. And then it, goes back to the trio melody. So John Philip Sousa made a great impact on American culture, and he made it with marches. He wrote several operettas, but we don't hear them today, really. It's the marches.
Well, and I think, that's to your point. People who are not even in the military don't even really listen to that kind of music. Everyone recognizes those basic tunes that you're talking about, right? Sousa is still a musical touchstone. What, 100, almost 100 and 120, 130 years after he composed these things. And how many other musicians and composers can we say that about?
Well, not that many. I mean, not certainly not necessarily in the popular music field. I mean, you have classical, a handful of classical composers, say Dvorak, for example, who spent a few years in America and wrote a symphony that we all recognize called From the New World. And it has that very familiar melody, da 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 dum da da dum da dum, which I think called "Rolling Home" or something. And I mean they've lasted, but not so much so with the popular things like Sousa. So Sousa is not unique in that he's remembered, but he's certainly really, really important. And you said that it's just like the kind of story I told about the Washington Post. People don't necessarily know the background of the Washington Post or the Sousa, but once you get them start singing it, they know it. And
right.
And the march style hasn't really hasn't totally gone out of style, but if you go today to a high school football game or say a UGA football game, the band may play some march-like pieces in the stands, like fight songs we would call them or something like that. But the halftime marching drills are not so much marches anymore. They play popular music, and they don't take the same military step that the military marches do. I mean, there are exceptions. If you ever have opportunities to see a halftime show from Texas A&M, for example, their band is uniformed like the Corps of Cadets, and they're marching the old what we call 6-5, military step.
Mhm.
But the bands today, I mean, the marching step for bands sort of evolved. It was the military step. And then when I was in high school, everybody was marching 8 steps to the 5 yards instead of 6. And that was step. Then they went to the drum corps model, and they're making all these evolving shapes, and it's a totally different thing, and not really playing march music very
Right.
much for that. But a march can almost immediately set a mood and put the listener in a certain mood. And I think, for example, what pops in my head is Star Wars music. John Williams, right? There's a lot of march-like music in there.
Right.
And when you hear that music, it immediately makes you think of these marching things they were fighting, whatever.
Stormtroopers, yeah.
Stormtroopers,
Yeah,
thank you.
The Imperial March is you could call it the anthem of nerddom, and I can say that as a nerd myself. So
yeah,
I guess the genre still has something to bring to us.
Absolutely. And if we'd never had the Washington Post, the Star Stripes Forever, you wouldn't have had the Imperial March.
I think there's no better way to end that. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Foreman, for taking the time to be with us today and share a little bit about marches, share a little bit about Sousa. And we hope to hear from you again soon, both vocally and musically.
Well, it was my great pleasure to be with you.
So we hope you've enjoyed that talk with Dr. Foreman and enjoyed this delve just a little bit into the life of John Philip Sousa. And of course, we can't have a presentation on music and on composers without ending with a little piece that we have to play. So please enjoy the most popular song of Sousa that I'm sure we all recognize. Tap your foot, get up, march around the room to the Stars and Stripes Forever. Thanks for joining us, and until we see you again, stay safe and take care.